Okay, good afternoon everyone. Last speaker before lunch, so we'll try not to be too slow. So what I wanted to cover off today is just some of the ideas about the use of technology in our southern beef systems and some of the things that we're starting to explore here. In particular, and that's just our Twitter handle, in particular what I'll focus on today is the potential to use some of the technologies that are currently widespread in the dairy industry for use in our southern systems. So the example here is from SCR, who are owned by Allflex, and this particular monitoring device is a bit unique compared to some of the others in the industry, in that not only is it measuring the level of activity of the cow, so it's a collar worn around the neck, it's also measuring rumination levels. So that gives another indicator. I'll show some figures in a minute of why that could be important. So this video just gives you an overview of some of the applications within the dairy industry. This is a North American barn situation. So pretty powerful tool, obviously, in the dairy industry. So the interest therefore is, can we use some of this device within our systems? So particularly what we're focusing on initially is around disease. So this figure here comes from a report last year, which just shows the most important endemic diseases affecting the cattle industry in southern Australia. So in particular, and it shows the economic cost to the industry, or estimated economic cost to the industry. So in particular, with this device, we'll be looking at dystocia with a particular focus on heifers, and also looking at bloat. So two of the diseases closer to the top of the list there. This is some work from cows actually at pasture, done by Sydney Uni by Cameron Clark and his colleagues, and just shows why having that ability to detect rumination as well as activity could be pretty important. So if we look at activity, which is the squares, compared to the diamonds, which is rumination, we can see in terms of the day before calving that there's actually not a significant change in activity, but there was a decrease in rumination. So it was actually the rumination, the ability to detect rumination, that actually gave the predictor for when those cows were going to calve, as opposed to the activity only increased post-calving. And this is summarised on a daily basis. This device and the one we're using, and this is a picture from down at Holbrook, actually transmits every, I'm going to say, 20 seconds, and then that's it's collated into blocks of time for analysis. But anyway, we want to look at dystocia and to see whether obviously heifers are going to be more vulnerable to this. Can we predict calving time using these devices in the beef scenario, and secondly, because there's going to be perhaps 10% of cattle in these herds in this particular herd will require assistance in calving, is there any differences in patterns that we can detect by using this device? So these collars went on to cattle in a herd at Holbrook on Tuesday. You can see up here behind the ear, this is actually the where the sensors are for rumination. They sit up behind the ear. The weight, it's just a weight underneath here that you can see. That's just to hold the collar in the correct place. So the cattle are back out in their paddock. The area that we can cover with one unit, which is all we've been loaned, is a 10 hectare area. So the cattle effectively need to come within that 10 hectare range at least once a day to download the data. But pretty much that'll cover the particular paddock that Bruce has them in. And so I can't actually show you any more pictures because the antennas, etc. So there's an antenna set up will be set up at the side of the paddock. That's happening tomorrow. That'll transmit 2 kilometres back to a computer at Bruce's house, and then upload it to the internet from there to then potentially in the future, if we're able to validate it, then that comes onto your handheld device. That's how they're used in the dairy industry. So second question, as I said, is looking at an acute disease. And And so we're focusing here on bloat. And so the question being, well, can we use this remote monitoring technology to identify changes in animal behaviour that indicate that either that an animal is at risk of bloat, and perhaps the severity of that bloat, and also and maybe perhaps as an indicator on a herd level if you didn't have collars on all animals. So why do we think this might be possible? Well, there is definitely a change in behaviour when animals are bloated. This is some data from MIN, but I've talked to Ted Wolfe, who did a lot of the bloat work here in Armidale back in the 1970s, and he had similar observations. These results aren't statistically significant, but what they show is the average time spent either grazing, ruminating or idling. And what we can see here is that animals that were bloated, so this column here, tended to spend more time idling and slightly less time ruminating. So if this device actually does work and we can actually detect rumination in beef cattle, then potentially the commercial application can be to identify steers that are bloating. So our intention is actually to test this in a grazing systems context. So the context of an experiment that we're hoping to run, looking at the proportion of lucerne in lucerne grass in a pasture, and so looking at whether that actually, by manipulating the proportion of grass to lucerne, we can reduce the risk of bloat, and so using these devices in that context. So the last thing to quickly touch on, John, is another area, I guess, in the space of robotics that we're looking to do. So we're currently setting up collaboration with the Australian Centre for Field Robotics at Sydney Uni, and also with Graminus Consulting. And some of you would have seen in the news in the last, I think it's only been in the last week or two, this is the swag bot from ACFR, which they've been road testing. So our intention is to look at this within grazing systems, and in particular to look at pasture quantity and quality, so putting sensors on this device, on this robot that's continually monitoring the pastures around the farm, and then that could then be fed into a decision support tool to actually allow management decisions on farm. So for example, when James is talking about monitoring pasture every 90 days and making decisions around trading based on that 90-day observation, here he's potentially got real-time data to make that sort of decision. So that's early stages of discussions, but that's another area we're looking to do work in. So that's it from me, John.
Thanks, John.